we look at the barriers to communication. And this is an important part, I think, with something that you study when you're a student and you're on a course. You're going to do a module on barriers to communications. But I've also recognized, Rory, that barriers to communications are something that kind of overarch the whole of counseling practice, because as things change, we need to revisit these barriers to communication with the recent introduction of online, telephone counseling, digital ways of communicating. It brings other barriers up, but let's revisit those foundations that are the barriers of communication.
Well, thank you, Ken. I mean, I think that, as you rightly say, counseling is all about communication. And it's about hearing the person in front of you and being very, very clear what they're saying. And also, when you respond to the person in front of you, them being very clear about what you're saying. And sometimes in school, it's called listening and responding. For those of us who have children, listening, responding is something that's taught in schools. But there are some real barriers to communication. And as someone who taught counselling for over a decade, you get a first-hand experience of what may be some of the biggest barriers. And one of them, surprisingly enough, is not listening.
Yes.
Not listening to what the person said. Many years ago, I remember teaching a class, and we did this wonderful exercise called "This is what I think you said," where one person for 1 minute speaks to someone else about something that's happened, and then the other person who sat quietly listening responds, paraphrases back. And I was observing one couple, this is a long time ago, and the person was saying that they'd had some road rage, they'd accidentally cut in front of someone's car and someone was waving the fist and it was very frightening. And the person was listening intently. And when it came to that person's time to respond, the person said, "I think you need to probably do an advanced driving course." It was like, oh, no. Advice. no, you've kind of missed it out there. You know, the words frightened, road rage. Yeah. And it was interesting. You could see the other person really kind of stepping back and not listening properly and not knowing how to respond, I think, is one of the biggest barriers. Yeah. And that is before we get into the other barriers, Ken. There's quite a lot of them.
Yeah. And when we're speaking about barriers to communication, what we're really saying is that when a client or someone is presenting and they're coming to us and they're bringing their content, they're bringing their material, they are communicating with us. And whether that is online, via email, in person, verbally, what is in the way? What is blocking what they are saying from reaching us, from landing, from us being able to use effective listening, being able to understand what they're bringing in? What is getting in the way? And you've just mentioned not actively listening. I mean, that is a big one. If you're not actively listening, there's a massive wedge in the way. What is being said is not going to get through to you. And when we look at barriers of communication, it's about looking to ourselves. There are certain external barriers, and I think we should start with an external barrier to communication, which I think is a pretty obvious one. If you're in a busy coffee shop where there's a lot of people around and there's clinking of plates and knives and forks, that could be a barrier of communication. It's called an environmental distraction. If you maybe have a counselling room where you meet with somebody and outside they're doing some road repairs and they've got the jackhammers out, or trucks driving up and down or making a lot of noise, that could be a barrier to communication. And that's maybe an obvious one that we would hear and go, oh, this is getting in the way with me being able to properly hear what you are saying. But there are some that are more subtle, aren't there, Rory? Some that may be unseen, specifically to the listener or the counsellor, where there are barriers, invisible barriers, that can distort what the client is bringing or cause that what the client brings not get heard or understood in its entirety.
Yeah, absolutely, Ken. And one of those invisible barriers could be something as simple as someone with a hearing difficulty.
Yes.
Really simple. Not for the person with a hearing difficulty, not being able to hear or not being able to hear at all. Someone who might rely on lip reading, or someone who might rely on signing. The two different ways within the deaf community. And I think it's really important that, if you're working with someone with a hearing impairment, that you kind of try to understand what is their preferred way of communicating, and something as simple as facing the person and speaking so they can read your lips,
Yep.
not covering your mouth or not sitting at an angle that might be difficult, and maybe just asking them, can you understand me? I think that's a really good start, isn't it? Not presuming that because your lips are moving that it can be read, I think is a very good start.
Yes, and again, that is a barrier to communication that you may pick up on, and then may be able to address, and maybe that the person would say, I can't hear you properly, or you may even say, you speak really softly and I can't hear you properly. And these can be addressed. And even more subtle are barriers that are unseen, such as a cultural barrier, where you have, and we need to recognize that our culture comes basically from, there's culture and there's heritage, which are different, but usually your heritage would kind of inform the culture you live in. And I look at my own culture, I look at how I grew up, I look at the family I grew up in, and the time that I grew up, the messages that were given to me by my primary caregivers, which was my mother and my father, what they told me was good, what they told me was bad, what they told me we do at certain times of year, what kind of holidays we celebrate, what kind of beliefs we hold. And these were given to me. I didn't choose them. They were given to me as I was growing up. It was told to me, this is how it is. And I need to recognize that is how I look at the world. I look through a cultural lens of who I am, how I was brought up, and that surrounded me. And we need to think, what does it look like when somebody comes in with a very different a different culture, different beliefs that they hold? They grew up in a different place, maybe a different country, maybe a different ethnicity, a completely different value system that they may have. If they are saying something, are we able to clearly hear it, or are we filtering it through our cultural lens? Because that is a barrier. They can say one thing and we can hear something else. And an example is something that I picked up on a television program. And I'm going to put the scenario out first, and then we'll evaluate the cultural ramifications of this. And the question is, or the challenge is, in your mind, listening to this now, if I was to tell you that there was a man and he was married, but he had to go away and he had to go and work away for just over a year. He went and he worked away for over a year. And then when he came back, he found that his wife had a child from a different partner. What does that bring up for you culturally from how you were brought up when you hear that story? Is that right? Is that wrong? Is that good? Is that bad? And you'll make a call or a judgment on that. And I certainly have my call or judgment on that. But I watched an interesting documentary about a tribe in Africa called the Himba tribe. And the Himba men will take the cows out to pasture and they'll be gone for more than a year. And it is common for them to come home, and their wife, their chosen partner, lifelong partner, would have a child from another member of the tribe. And within their culture, this is embraced. This is how it is. They tribally bring up the children, and this is a regular thing. So culturally, if we were hearing that story from somebody telling us, would we be making a cultural judgment on that? Or because does that not create a barrier? They mean one thing, we might go, oh, that's terrible for you. And they could be, but no, that's not terrible. So there's an example of cultural difference.
Yeah, absolutely, Ken. And I think one of the biggest barriers to communication is actually the places where the listener can't go. And that might be something around sex or death or any of those kind of very profound human conditions. And you sometimes hear it in everyday conversations where someone brings up something that might be socially awkward, and the person who's listening kind of changes the subject. Oh, have you seen that dog out there looking at that flower? Because you know that they can't go there. And I think it's probably more pronounced than we really think. Have a think about what would you not like to kind of engage with? What conversations don't you like to engage with? Could it be something around loss and bereavement? Some people just aren't very good talking about death. Some people find it very, very difficult to talk about sex or people's sexual proclivications. I think that's the right word.
Big words, Rory. Big words.
Probably best to know how to pronounce them before you use them. And some people are very worried. I mean, I've had students who've said, "Oh, what happens if someone talks about, having an orgy? I'd feel very embarrassed about that." And I said, "Well, that's their choice, and you need to think about what's going on for you. You don't have to get involved in orgies. No one's suggesting that, but it might be." It might be worth you thinking about where does the embarrassment lie? What messages have you got about what constitutes, a healthy sexual life? And I think that is quite a big one. And also, faith and religion, I think, is one that people really, really, really try to shy away from. If you're working with someone who has a different faith position to you, you may be agnostic or have no belief at all. Are you going to audit yourself in case you say the wrong thing? And I think this is something that's coming up more and more in our society, where we're becoming more diverse. It's not just religion; it's about sexuality, transgender issues, in terms of people identifying as something, and people just really worried about saying the wrong thing. So instead of getting involved in a dialogue and an exploration, what happens is they say, "Well, I won't say anything, therefore I can't make any mistakes." And the person who's being listened to just doesn't feel validated or understood.
You can't be fully there with a person if you're running through checks and balances of, should I say, I shouldn't say, I'm feeling this, but I've got to park that one side, and you're involving yourself in a process that is no longer active listening. You've got an internal dialogue going on. You're having a conversation with yourself rather than engaging as a listener to what the speaker is bringing. And I think that ties very nicely into where you started of saying not actively listening. And so many of these barriers to communication can kind of link back to that not actually listening. And then another area where there could be a barrier in communication is the use of jargon, the use of acronyms that might not be mutually understood. This comes, I guess, at a time where technology is changing all the time, and depending on your culture, and you can see how these all tie in together. You may have a person, let's say a young person that is very active on the internet, using new texting technologies, using shortened versions of words, LOL instead of laugh out loud, which would be used in a text. Are they mutually understood? Are we maybe using jargon that might not be understood by the speaker? So we're feeding something back and using a little bit of jargon that is not fully understood. Am I giving them the UPR? Well, what is UPR? Well, if you studied counselling, UPR is unconditional positive regard. But if you walk up to a person in a coffee bar and say, "What do you think of UPR?" there is an instant barrier to communication. So thinking about jargon, and it goes both ways. The barrier to communication is not just about you as the listener or as the counselor. It's looking at both sides of the relationship. The barrier can come from either side. And I think this discussion is about recognizing that there are barriers that come into communication, being open to looking out for barriers that may come up in communication, and thinking about how you might work if you recognize a barrier, because we can't ignore it or go, "Well, I'm not going to feel that way when it comes up for me." It's about recognizing and going, "Okay, I see here is a barrier. How am I going to work with that?" FOMO. You don't want to have any FOMO.
Oh, no.
No, you don't want.
No.
Now, FOMO, what is FOMO? Is it a soft, squishy cushion? No.
Is it a drink?
Is it a drink? A delicious drink. It is fear of missing out. But here again, it's a shortened version of a word that might be used in text, or it's actually used quite a lot lately. I've heard it being used a lot. They tend to go in trends, but it's a use of jargon, which can be a barrier to communication, Rory.
Absolutely. And one big barrier can be class. and the language that attaches itself to class. I remember many years ago sitting in my certificate class, and the external moderator came in to ask some questions. So what happens usually at the end of a course, the external moderator comes in and has a chat with the students to make sure they're happy with the course, and all is good. And I remember this person sat at the end, and she said, I'm sure that you're all getting involved in lots of autodidactic activities. And everybody just stared at each other. and fortunately, and I'm not sort of bigging myself up here, I knew actually what that meant, but I would say that 90% of the class had absolutely no idea. And I just said to the moderator, I said, I wonder if you could explain what that meant, because I'm not really sure. I actually told a bit of a lie for the greater good. And she said, oh, self-learning. And I think that what happens is and I found out myself, as you become more educated, you take on the language of education, and it kind of seeps out into your everyday conversations. And sometimes you can leave people behind, and more importantly, you can make people feel less than, because it's almost like they're not in this clique. They're not in this discussion. But it also goes the other way. I can remember one of my students said, I've got clients who said that everything's bobbins. I have no idea what that meant. Well, I actually sitting in a former mill town. If I look out the window, I can see what's left of the mills and that part of the Industrial Revolution here in the UK. And bobbins means not very good. It's a term that kind of gets into the dialects of people who live in the north of England, especially around mill towns, where they say it's bobbins, and it means it's not very good. And in fact, if you go just slightly up the road to Bury, you might hear someone say it's bangers, which again is another kind of colloquialism for it's not very good. So it can go both ways. But when we fall into that use of jargon or colloquial language, it can certainly cause a bit of confusion.
Yeah, and it's interesting. You led into that to speaking about class and socio-economic class, where you live, how you grew up. It can influence how you see the world, the language that you use. You're speaking about slang there, or use of jargon.
Yeah.
It can come from a cultural base, and when you look at these barriers to communication, so many of them kind of just knit together so well. And I think you've just painted that really beautifully there, Rory. That's bob on. That is the way that you've.
It's a Bobby Dazzler.
It's a Bobby Dazzler. So we're now. And if you're listening to this and you go, well, I don't know why they're giggling at Bobby Dazzler, because I don't know what they're talking about. There it is. How you can see how that barrier comes in. And now, if you live in the UK and you are of a certain age and you watch certain television programs, then Bobby Dazzler, you would realize it means something that is really good. It's kind of really good. That's what Bobby Dazzler means. But it is a use of slang. It may be cultural, and it creates a gap. It creates a slight misunderstanding of what's being given. And so often, maybe the speaker or the client wouldn't have courage to do what you did, Rory, and go, I wonder what you meant there. Because you can sometimes feel foolish by asking a question. So they may just go, okay. But there's a gap. There's a little bit of a gap. And that's what we're talking about with barriers to communication, where the understanding breaks and it can lead to a degradation of the relationship. And counselling or active listening and using counselling skills is all based on that relationship. We want to strengthen that relationship. We want to create equality. And these barriers to communication are things that kind of come in the way. And I think we'd be remiss, Rory, if we didn't speak about the technology gap, specifically with how things have moved, specifically in counseling and psychotherapy. With the use of technology has been something that has been pretty prevalent in counseling and psychotherapy. However, with the recent pandemic that is now hopefully behind us, or the worst of it at least, it changed things because people were cut off. Many people needed to turn to technologies in order to communicate. But there can be a great gap there a barrier of, can a person use that technology? Do they know how to work their way around that technology? What kind of feelings does it bring up when they engage with that technology? Do they not like it? Does it kind of bring anxiety up? And I remember when I first got a computer, it would cause me incredible anxiety doing the simple things. People would say, oh, all you need to do is click here and do that and do the next thing and click on the menu. And I was thinking, what is a menu? What's a menu? Open a browser. What's a browser? Go to your browser tab. What's a tab? And I was missing the jargon, and I was working with technology, and it created anxiety for me. Technology can be a gap, and we need to recognize that technological gap that can come in, not even if you're using the technology, even if you're just discussing it in a face-to-face and you might be using words, again, jargon, that relate to the technology.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the things that technology has been really, really good at through the years, and tech companies, is giving us a standard form of language. You know, if you think of anything you buy nowadays, all the buttons are standardized, whether you buy a computer or a television. All, on and off is a universal symbol now. And I think that when we use technology, we sometimes probably don't know how much we know. And I think if you're working online, it's really good to do that old teacher's trick of trying to find out what knowledge someone's got and use that as a starting base. But you're right. And also, I think that one of the areas to really keep an eye on is choosing the modality you use or the method of communication you use when you decide to do online and telephone counselling. I particularly wouldn't be any good at all at text or email therapy by the fact I'm dyslexic.
Yeah.
I'm not good at literation. I think that's the word for it. That's a word I do know. Literation.
Well, I've just learned it. Thanks, Rory.
I think no letters, please. And I wouldn't engage in email therapy because I just don't have that capacity to write. I know lots of people who write beautifully and can really express emotion and context. It's something that escapes me. I hope I can speak it better than I can write it. I guess only you, the listener, will know that. So I wouldn't choose to write. And there may be some people who would prefer to write rather than communicate over the internet. So I think if you're thinking about, how you're going to communicate, maybe worth having to think about where your strengths are, do a strengths-based kind of analysis, and also thinking about, how you're going to transmit that to your client. If a client approached me and said, well, we want to do text, then it'd be, well, thank you for thinking of me, but it's not an area that I use. I don't think I'd work well with that. But I can refer you on to someone who probably be able to give you a lot of help.
Yeah. And I mean, that is in service of the client, really, because and in service of yourself, because it's not your chosen medium. But if you were to engage in, let's say, email, and you were to maybe make grammatical errors or spelling errors due to your dyslexia, that could be a barrier for the person reading it. Oh, he doesn't even care enough to spell the words right or to use the right grammar. It could become a barrier to communication. So you're recognizing that for you is a barrier, and you're making a choice of how you practice based on that. And I think that's the takeaway here. That's what this is all about. Look at your position as a active listener or in a helping profession wherever you work, or as a counselor, and look at your culture, look at your slang that you might use, look at the barriers that may come up in your interactions with others, and plan for it. If we're asking these questions, then we're putting the work in beforehand, and that's always the best place to put it in. I think there's a Chinese proverb, I may be quoting this wrong, saying, when is the best time to plant a tree? And the best time to plant a tree is 20 years ago. It is. It just is. But if you didn't plant that tree 20 years ago. The second best time to plant a tree is now. And the same is true. You know, when you're talking about these barriers to communication, the best time to look at them is way before you're in the interaction with the person. And that's why we have these conversations in service of the clients that may come to us, bring us their materials one day. So we encourage you to have that debate, speak to colleagues, journal about it, have a think about you, the barriers to communication that may come up in your relationship.